Hi, I'm Yoav. I work on Chromium as part of the Chrome team. I'm co-chairing the web platform incubation community group at the W3C, as well as an API owner, Blink API owner, among other roles. And I'm here today to discuss both the Chromium and Blink processes, but also talk about how the Blink process and open standard processes work together. Chromium is a very large open source project. We see around 91 commits a year from over 2,200 different people. Those are the stats from the last year. Those people are working for 42 different companies, as well as we had contributions from 92 individuals, which is super exciting. Potentially, those companies also have multiple organizations inside of them, each having different interests and pulling in different directions. It's important to recognize that although a lot of those contributions are coming from Google employees, non-Google contributors are over 20% of that pie chart. And as someone who was a Chromium contributor many years before becoming a Google employee, that's something that's near and dear to my heart. So in order to manage all those contributions from different parties, we need an open process. We needed to make sure that the project is making progress towards its goals and remains true to its mission. The process we use in Chromium for all web exposed changes is called the Blink process or the intent process. The goal of that process is to evaluate the risks and benefits of new features, weigh in opinions from other vendors, from the W3C technical architecture group, as well as from web developers, and make a call as to whether the feature is something we think Chromium should ship by default. That process interacts with the standards process, but it is definitely not a replacement for it. If other browsers never adopt the features we ship, those features will not be interoperable, and developers won't be able to rely on those features to be part of the platform and to use them freely in the wild. And that is not our goal. At the same time, if every browser waited for other browsers to ship first, that would result in deadlock and stagnation of the platform. And sometimes, in order to convince other vendors and other parties that a use case is important, we need data which we can only get by real-life usage of that certain feature. Therefore, we unfortunately often find ourselves in a position where we are the first browser engine to ship new features. And in order to reduce the risk there, we make sure that there's a clear path for other vendors to follow by investing a lot in testing infrastructure and requiring comprehensive test suites as well as detailed specifications for all the features we ship. So that even if we can get those features to be interoperable out of the gate, we can get to eventual interoperability by making it easier for other browser engines to follow. And the Blink process's role in this is to properly manage that risk versus benefit calculus. Because even though Google may contribute more than other organizations to Chromium, we are not the majority in standards. On the left, you can see that Chromium, like the Chromium contributors chart we saw earlier. The graph on the right shows you the number of individual participants in the W3C by company. And although Google is still a large slice of that, we are only about an eighth of overall participation. And if you, even if you add up all of the major Chromium browsers in that pie chart, you will still find that Chromium participants are less than a quarter of the whole chart. So in short, the web is broader than the Chromium project, and that's a good thing. And the web also has its own set of processes, and we as Chromium contributors need to work in that world too. So at Google, we try very hard to drive collaboration between the different feature teams from the different organizations and the wider web standards community by consistently participating in open standards groups like the W3C, the WebWG, the ITF, TC39, and more, and bringing the use cases that we see to those groups in order to incubate them in public. We work together with the broader community in those groups, and we are constantly refining our approach to that. One example is our focus on incubation first, which is one that we started championing a few years ago. Incubation was conceived as a way to explore new additions and new features to the web platform with relatively low overhead, but without commitment. Because some ideas fail, and some ideas should fail. And we didn't want to get those ideas baked into standards before realizing whether or not they are a great idea or one that should fail. Incubation in the YCG, the Web Platform Incubator Community Group, as one example, is a great way for us to work together with the broader community in public and collect both feedback as well as intellectual property commitments from contributors to those specifications so that the eventual standard will be something that is free to implement for all. But we can do that, we can do all that with low overhead. In short, the idea is to get to 80% of an exploration journey with those low overhead incubations, but do that responsibly and openly. And that leads to a couple of key points. Incubations can actively fail, go into deep freeze, waiting for more data or more interest, or in some cases, they may ship in one browser or another prior to transitioning to an officially recognized standard. In that latter case, this is not the end of the story. Of course, not everyone agrees on which incubations are ready to ship because everyone have different priorities. But when Chromium ships incubation status specifications, that is because we believe that they are needed, but don't necessarily have agreement from other vendors to turn them into standards. And in those cases, we are taking on a deeper responsibility to continue to maintain those features and continue to push for cross-vendor standardization for them. If those features do get picked up later by other vendors, we have a responsibility to work together with them and potentially change what we already shipped in case it is truly necessary in order to make them into cross-industry standards. Incubations are not standards yet. Incubations only turn into standards when a sufficient cross-industry set of participants in open standards agree that they should become interoperable standards. Until multiple vendors want to ship those interoperable implementations, there is only so much a single vendor can do. We do control our ship cycles. We do choose what features Chromium believes are critical to provide to web developers out there. But what becomes standards is a broader community decision, and that broader community needs to want that to happen. So as incubations mature and there's open agreement that there should be an interoperable standard, it's time to create an official working group with multiple cross-industry stakeholders and for alternatively for the incubation to be adopted by one. And then we set timelines for the deliverables. We formalize use cases and finalize the design. We make sure to get wide review of that design, and particularly reviews addressing accessibility, privacy, internationalizations, and other wide review issues. And we can finalize the test suite and make sure everything is well tested. And then we are well on our way to finalize it as a standard, which is a lengthy process. You should note that some standard processes can be a little bit different across the different organizations. So for example, the W3C process is slightly different from the WG one, and those are different from the TC39 ones. But with that in mind as the end goal, I wanted to walk you through the journey of a feature in Chromium from idea to shipping. The process I'm about to describe is outlined in detail in the launching features page on chromium.org, which is definitely a recommended read. And how do you get started working on a feature? The first question you want to ask yourself is, what do I work on, or what do we work on for the broader team? And it's tempting to think that the Chrome team or the Chromium project have some detailed internal feature plan for what APIs will be added to the web platform in priority order with exact ship dates over a multi-year plan. But even though we obviously do try to plan ahead, that's not really how it works. In reality, the Chromium project listens to a large number of inputs in order to tell us what areas need attention. Because we often see that the problems are best understood by the developers that are facing them in their day-to-day lives. So with that in mind, we work very closely with various web developer partners to get insight into how their work is progressing and what rough edges of the web they're running up against. I know that many other organizations also do the same with their own partners. We also recommend a tool initiated by our colleagues at Microsoft, the Web We Want initiative, which is a great place to share ideas that web developers may have. And browser and web platform engine folks all participate in triaging suggestions there and cherry picking some of them. There are also active web platform discussions in the YCG Discourse, which is the main venue for incubation work. That venue contains a good mix of discussions on proposed solutions alongside use cases and pain points brought up by folks from the developer community. It used to also be the place where new concrete proposal gets posted to seek broader support, but we recently transitioned that part to a dedicated repo that enables us as chairs to keep track of the different incubations, the support they got and from whom, which one of them were adopted by the community group, and which ones graduated to a working group. And finally, we also participate in a number of other channels. We listen to the results of the MDN survey and pay a lot of attention to the framework ecosystem, where we have a lot of ongoing dialogues with those folks and work with them to bring about new primitives that will, make the web developers' lives easier, as well as eventually make the user's life, like the user experience, better. And of course, we also have many other conversations, including Twitter, for those who engage. Once we've identified a problem space we want to address, it's time to start a process of exploring that feature space. Step one in that process is to spend time researching the problem. Although we're not always perfect at this, we need to try very hard to focus first on the problem and not on the proposed solution. But the initial focus must be on researching the use cases, the problem space, and the developer needs, rather than first inventing a solution. The goal of this stage is to publicly publish an explainer with those use cases detailed. There might be a suggested solution, but it is critically important at this stage to not fall in love with your first good idea. To put it another way, if the explainer contains a design for a great hammer, every one of those use cases will end up looking like a nail. And unless you really do the research, you won't know that you're actually dealing with screws, and a screwdriver would be a better fit. An explainer at this stage is a short document, hopefully no more than a page or two, that explains the problem space and the various use cases that you're trying to tackle. This is the point where the explainer should go to a public forum. Historically, published to the YCG Discourse to gain attention from the broader community, or more recently to the proposals repo if it's in a more mature state and contains a concrete proposal. One common issue I see with intents that people send, a lot of people send out intents without an explainer, which makes them very hard for both API owners and the general public to review and to just know what the thing is. If you're adding a feature or if you're adding a small addition to an existing API, which you consider trivial, and for some reason creating a separate explainer document is something that feels a lot like overhead, you can always inline a short explainer. But the important bits, again, are to explain what the thing is, the motivation for it, what is the rough API shape, and how are developers supposed to be using it. Those are all things that are very important to understand when reviewing proposals, and are typically hard to dig out from, for example, GitHub issues that span 50+ comments. One more thing at this stage is to get developer involved, and at this stage, opening up the process early is a way to get different viewpoints than your own on the problems you're trying to solve. And we are, after all, building the platform for the entire web, not just for ourselves. In terms of maturity, this stage of the feature idea is somewhat like a newborn kitten. It's hard to tell exactly what it will look like as it matures, and it needs a lot of care and attention. The next step, once we have a clear understanding of what we're trying to solve and why, is to figure out what the solution may look like, try it out, see how it can be improved, and then rinse and repeat until we're fairly confident we got it right. At this point, the Chromium engineer working on this problem would want to notify other folks on the project that they plan to start landing code related to this problem behind a flag. That's what the intent to prototype email is for. Intent emails are sent over to the Blink Dev mailing list and serve as a notification to the broader Blink community of work that's happening in a certain area. This step was previously called intent to implement, but that resulted in a lot of confusion, as it wasn't clear that this only means landing code behind a flag and not some stronger commitment. As a result, Mozilla renamed the similar step in their process to intent to prototype, and we align with them to reduce confusion. The purpose of this step is to make sure code owners won't be surprised when they see code starting to land in this area. But starting to work on a prototype doesn't really require any kind of project-wide approvals. This is also a good checkpoint to make sure that the feature is on the right track. Did you file for a tag review of the explainer and the initial design? Did we try to get feedback from other vendors? If that hasn't happened yet, that checkpoint here gives us a lot of time to correct that before we actually want to ship the feature. So how can developers get involved in this particular stage? Browser engineers at these stages are typically, or should be, craving for feedback. The last steps deliverable was an explainer outlining the use case. One form of feedback could be to point out related use cases that are missing from it, or in case there is a proposed design, pointing out ways in which it can be improved. Otherwise, a statement of support and real-life examples related to the use case are also super helpful. And if this is a subject you're familiar with and want to get more involved, hopping over to the GitHub repo and participating in the early design work is awesome. And especially if we can get web developers to do that in that early stage, that can provide super helpful feedback. By the time an intent to prototype is sent, there's probably some rough design in mind, but it's typically not too late to change course. At that point, feedback on the API shape, ergonomics, or its ability to solve problems is very much welcome. At that stage, some code might be landing and the API metaphorically opens its eyes and starts wobbling around. It's still extremely early, so no telling how it will end up. The next major step in a features journey is to evolve the design by experimenting in code, working together with the community on the design, and simply iterating on its development. At this point, engineers will be landing code in Chromium under flags and asking web developers to try out those designs, even though the features are switched off by default. This is also the stage where open collaboration with others in the standard space becomes even more important to make this a multi-stakeholder effort. How can web developers get involved at this point? Well, this stage is really all about the web developer involvement. This is where we'll be asking web developers to try out the evolving designs by turning on flags and testing them out. We also have another tool that comes into play at this point in time. In Chrome, we have a tool called Origin Trials. It's not a mandatory step, but it's a great way to get even broader developer testing on a feature. The Chromium engineer sends out an intent to experiment, and then once it's approved, any developer can register for a key on their specific domain, which will turn the feature on for their users, whether their users enable a flag or not. So essentially, it turns on the feature for the specific domain. This origin trial has some specific characteristics to prevent the feature from getting too popular and be accidentally burned into the platform. But it's a great way to broadly test features in a wide variety of users, not just those early adopters who might be convinced to turn on some magical flags. And Microsoft Edge is also running a similar program for origin trials with a slightly different set of features. So developers can theoretically run experiments across those two different browsers in the wild, even if that requires a separate registration. At this point, if we're talking about the feature's maturity, it's somewhat like a teenager. It's maturing, it's pretty stable and self-supporting, but still potentially goofing around quite a bit. You can see a lot of the shape it will take on eventually. And finally, when we're confident that an API is in good shape and would solve real developer and user problems, that's when it's time to try and ship it. That's the point in the process where we have to be a bit more strict. Chromium developers that want to ship a feature on by default need to prove that it's mature enough to do that without excessive risk. We talked earlier about the risk and benefit assessment that the API owners need to do for each shipping feature. This is the point where that assessment happens, and shipping a new feature requires 3 API owners to sign off on it, or LGTM it, which stands for looks good to me. It's important to note that the fact that an intent email was sent to Blink Dev means that the team behind the feature thinks it's ready, but doesn't yet mean that it will ship soon unless it's approved. There are many cases where the feature team is slightly optimistic and the API owners conclude that there's more work to be done before the feature can actually ship. That's fine, and that's part of the process. There are also cases, which are more rare, of features that don't ship due to fundamental disagreements, which means that the risk inherent in the feature is too high and is not offset by its benefits. It's important to reiterate that the goal of that process is to evaluate the risk and benefit trade-off of the feature. And when we talk about risks, we mostly talk about compatibility and interoperability risk. So you want your intent, when writing an intent, you want it to, again, explain what the thing is, either through an inline explainer or by linking to an external one. Show that the compat versus interop risk is low or alternatively outweighed by the benefits. Show that you reached out for review and responded to any feedback you got from TAG and other vendors that were actively engaged. And show that you paved the path for eventual interoperability by writing a comprehensive test suite and by having a solid specification for the feature. I mentioned earlier interoperability risk. It's mostly comprised of the following factors. Like when talking about interoperability risk, I'm talking about the risk of other browser engines not following and not implementing and shipping the features. And when evaluating that risk, the question we typically ask ourselves is, will we be shipping first? Will the feature first ship in Chromium, or are we following other browser engines? What do other browser vendors say about the feature? Are they supportive of it, objecting to it, or just neutral and haven't gotten around to implement it just yet? What would be the developer advice around the feature? How can we successfully activate that feature? And what do developers think of the feature, and the need for it? And then finally, web platform tests and solid specifications ensure that whenever other engines would want to follow us and implement the feature, they would be easily able to. When it comes to feedback, there are multiple forms. One is for asking for a tag review. There's a repo for design reviews on the W3C's tag organization, where we typically ask for reviews. And then there there's a separate process to ask for signals from other vendors, either on Mozilla's standards position repo or on WebKit Dev, the WebKit mailing list. And we also, like as far as the intent emails go, we used to have a template, but many folks used to simply copy old emails and then modify them. So copying old intents and modifying them, resulting in outdated templates people were using that were missing essential fields. Nowadays, chromestatus.com, which the URL here is truncated, apologies for that, but that site contains a guide that walks you through the process, essentially through the whole process, enables you to work on a feature there and make sure that you cover your bases and have like not forget any essential parts of the process. And essentially, at the end of it, also generates the intents for you and enables you to have like not bother with the template, and hopefully ensures that all the bits and pieces that are required for an intent are there. That site was recently revamped to include that guide. So your feedback on that process and on the site itself is very much appreciated. Okay, and finally, while the exciting parts of the process revolve around shipping new things, removing old and busted parts of the platform is equally important. It's important for security, for performance, and as well as for interoperability. If we refuse to remove old features, that means that adding any new feature would make it part of the platform forever and significantly increase its risk. And willingness to take some compat risk and remove features helps us ship faster and can also help other browser vendors who can then follow in our footsteps with reduced compat risk for their users. Feature removal is equally a part of the process, subject to an intent email and intent to remove, which similarly to an intent to ship requires approval from 3 API owners. That approval typically requires a high bar, or rather a low usage of the feature, to make sure that removing features don't break the web and don't cause too much compatibility pain and broken sites for our users. Yeah, we talked earlier about interop risk, which typically involves shipping new features. Removing older features incurs a compatibility risk, typically. And when assessing compatibility risk, questions we typically ask ourselves are, will we be the first ones to remove that feature? What is its shipping status for other vendors? Are we the first to remove? Was it never shipped elsewhere, etc.? We typically look at usage stats and what they mean. And that can also mean that we are digging into or asking the intent initiators to dig into the usage and understand what it looks like, and most critically, what would breakage look like? If we now remove the feature, are sites just feature detecting for it and then will continue to work normally, or will it break everything and present our users with broken experiences? Those are all questions that we need to answer in order to properly assess this compatibility risk. And finally, because we're all human, we need to account for cases where we shipped the wrong thing. One of the principles that enables us to take that interop risk of shipping first is our willingness to change course, and if proven to be needed, modify features or even unship them entirely. There are cases where after we shipped, substantial feedback from other vendors and developers convince us that we need to change the API shape. Our willingness to make those breaking changes then enables us to listen and act on that feedback. A few examples from the past are Web Components v0 and WebVR, where as a result of feedback, those APIs were unshipped and modified entirely. So even when an API is about to ship, there is still a lot of room for developer involvement, and web developer feedback on the intent thread can provide insights and have a lot of influence on the API's owner's decision. Similarly to the previous step, playing around with the implemented API and reporting issues that its implementation may have or its specification may have is extremely helpful. And finally, actually using the APIs is, at least for Chrome, an extremely strong signal that the API is indeed needed. And we typically keep track of usage for that purpose. And at that point, the feature is fully mature on its own, theoretically in the wild, but in practice sits on the couch all day. And I guess this is where the metaphor breaks down. To recap, the typical journey of an API goes from researching the problem space, publishing an explainer with the use cases outlined, designing the solution in the open with interested parties, experimenting with that solution, and eventually shipping it or not if we got it wrong. And note that at any stage, we can decide that we need to go back and address some issues. For example, an origin trial can reveal problems in our understanding of the problem space or with the design. And when that happens, we go back and modify the design or even rethink it entirely, given the new use cases. Also, there are always exceptions to this general flow. For example, like there are some notable examples of origin trials that are required to gather data in order to basically understand the use cases and whether they will provide performance benefits. That is also something that occasionally happens. So what should you take away from all of this? First, there is a difference between the Chromium process and the standards process, and you need to work in both of them, but they are not a replacement for each other. Our intent process is intended to make it possible for us to move the web platform forward, even if we have to go out on a limb sometime, but also to work together with the standards process, with other vendors and the broader community. And all of this is done in public and on purpose. And ultimately, we have to keep in mind that just shipping a feature is not the ultimate goal. Getting to an interoperable standard web platform feature is. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd love to answer any questions. Okay. Can you read out the questions? Because it's a bit tiny for me to, or let me try to tend the. Okay, feature flags are something that the user enables. They can be enabled in Canary Beta or Stable. They require a restart for the browser, but it's essentially something that the user has to take an action in order to enable. You can, like as a web developer, you can tell your users, go to this URL and click those buttons and then restart your browser, and this thing will work. But it's putting a lot of burden on the user. Origin trials enable a web developer to turn on the feature remotely. So essentially turn it on for all Chrome users for those particular domains that they register. So it's essentially enables experimentation in the wild with a wild set of users where feature flags typically enable a smaller set of users that are highly motivated to test the feature. Yeah, so that is features that did not make it to be standard features because of lack of interest. And the Chromium project no longer believes that they are required features. And for example, their usage haven't picked up, or some other, like we get new evidence indicating that this is no longer an important feature that we want to solve for web developers. That is what the removal, like intent to remove process is for. Deprecation is typically a part of that. So when removing features, we typically give users, give web developers a few releases of deprecation where we issue warnings that the feature will soon be removed, but it's still working. But yeah, the intent to remove process is that that process. Okay. Okay. So thanks all for your time, and I'll be in the hallway track in a few minutes if you have any other questions to ask there.